So what's in the menu is really just a couple of stories and then a model of that way of learning that we want to present, that we have used as a framework for both planning communities and also evaluating them. So it's a more formal way of talking about the learning of a community.
Okay, so here's a story of, this is a community of practice that we've been working with for about 10 years. They are internal auditors in the public sector in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia. You might think you couldn't get more dreary than that. Actually, this is one of the most successful communities of practice that we've worked with. The World Bank brought them together originally. There were a lot of these tensions of control, you know, how much control can we actually give these people? Do you realize that half these countries are at war? There's a lot of, you know, even how they sat, even when you had a list of people, you couldn't even put, you know, somebody from Russia above somebody from Georgia. You know, there's a lot of sort of tension. Georgia
not this Georgia.
So there was a lot of tension, and the World Bank felt like it really did need to control this, because otherwise things were just simply not going to work. And just this photo is sort of fast forwarding about 7 years later. And I just love this photo because here you see, I mean, I just took this as they were working together, but there's somebody, you know, there's a man from Armenia, there's Slav from Russia, there's, I can't remember her name, from Georgia. So you've got all these countries, and they're all working on stuff together. Okay. The tipping point did come when the bank managed to sort of let go control. And they didn't just let go control. What happened actually was the community, they got together, and after a few years, we decided to introduce actually the leadership groups with them. And the leadership groups, with the agenda activists, the community keepers, which sort of dispelled, distributed the leadership of the community, and the bank then started negotiating just with the leaders of the leadership groups. And so the community keepers started to be responsible for the different voices at the table. And they started to manage how we manage the relationships between Georgia and Russia and Ukraine. And since then, the community has just taken off. And the leadership groups run the community. And the bank, and I was facilitator of this for many years. For about 5 years, I've done nothing, right? I just sit back every now and then, they ask me something, and I talk to the leaders of the leadership groups, and that's it. But they've been, I mean, they meet, it's a big deal to meet. In the beginning, they met once a year. Now they meet twice a year. And how they meet is they have what they call plenaries, so they have big sessions where they have hundreds of people who come. And at those plenaries, they set up working groups. So the whole community decides, what do we need as a community? What are the things, what are the challenges for us? So they're internal auditors in the public sector. In Eastern Europe and Russia, they haven't had internal auditors. They always had external financial controllers. And so the role of internal auditor was a new one. But in order to join the European Union, you have to have internal auditors. And it was no good sending people in from Canada, from France, from UK, to tell them how to do internal auditing, because it was just nothing to do with their context. And so they had to work from scratch, really, to say, what is the role of an internal auditor in our region? And so they set up these working groups at first to say, okay, so, you know, if we look at ourselves on the international levels of what an internal auditor should be, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, well, we're still at 0. And so we need to distinguish what 0 means for us. And so they were working really with 0 and 1, those bottom levels. And so they spend a lot of time working together on saying, what does a 1 look to us, like to us, 2 look like to us? And so doing that. So, I mean, they produced all their different working groups end up by producing a book. Okay? And so they've produced, they did good practices, but they also, this is called their body of knowledge. They decided to document all their body of knowledge and to say, what do we need to know at level 0? What do we need to know at level 1? What do we need to know at level 2? So they then had 5 different levels and built up what they called a body of knowledge for each one, and then said, okay, if that's what we need to know, and if we can assess ourselves, what kind of training do we need in order to reach that? So countries do a self-assessment, and they say, okay, we're only level 2, what we need to do is this, and that's that good practice continuing professional, their manual template. So they've got a whole bunch of, they've produced manuals, they've produced templates for themselves to say, if you're level, whatever level you're at, these are the kind of templates and things that will be useful for you. So they have, and I mean, within the region, they have become, they've really developed a strategic voice, they've become a powerhouse in the region now for professional development. They're also fiercely independent. They keep away the World Bank, they keep away their secretariat. They say, no, we're doing this on our own. But they're producing really good results, and the region, in terms of internal auditing, is shooting up. So it's quite a,
It's an interesting example because yesterday I heard a number of times a problem with training principles and finding deliverers of training. This is an example of a community that has taken into its own hand training its own members, if you will. And they have produced a whole training and certification system in the region among themselves.
And this isn't only what they do. So, I mean, at a meeting, what will happen? So they've developed all sorts of practices. So the idea of a case clinic is one. So, and I should say, by the way, this is a very complex community because they use 3 languages. Everything is simultaneous translation: Russian, Serbo-Croatian, and English. So you're also talking across languages. So when I say people just roll up a chair and say X, what I mean is it goes through interpretation, and you've got to find often an interpreter. So it's there's a lot of potential for things going wrong. And, but at their meetings, I mean, they've developed a whole host of practices. So, and an important one is the case clinic. So, for example, somebody might come along, like the Kyrgyz Republic is still quite far behind, right? But very active in the leadership groups. And so she's a leader. She's a leader in the community, even though in terms of content, she's not a leader, right? But what she does is she will hold a case clinic. She will just call everybody round and say, we've got this problem in Kyrgyzstan, and will you help us? And she will outline the problem, and people will come in and help talk through her issues. And I mean, it's very rewarding to see, because these are people who don't normally talk to each other. When I first came in, the World Bank said, please can you come in? This is a dead community. Nobody talks to each other. You have to understand that people in this region are very reserved. Nobody takes the initiative. Everyone's afraid to stick their neck out. And, as I said, they are the most thriving and the most dynamic community of practice that we've seen. No.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
About the leadership groups.
Mm-hmm.
How do you facilitate the leadership groups in a virtual community of practice? How do you manage those roles in virtual?
Well, first of all, to be honest, we've never done it virtually on a big scale. We've done it on sort of small scales, but on a big scale. I mean, I wouldn't be afraid to do it. I've never had the opportunity. I definitely wouldn't be afraid to do it. I'd be more afraid that we had actually good, engaging, virtual discussions. And if you had that, then there would be something for the leadership groups to do. Otherwise, they might not have anything to do. And
I'm wondering about the individuals versus the community, call it, of internal auditors. So, I mean, I imagine that if something like this gets going and it gets going really well, it's amazing for the individuals who are involved in it, but then they quit or they move on, or, you know what I mean, other people come in, and so how do you, without simply handing that next person the book and saying, great, here's everything you need to know, I'm just wondering about that.
Yeah, it's a great question on a number of different levels. In this community, they have a very proactive way of dealing with newcomers. At every meeting, when newcomers come in, they get them to stand up, they welcome them, they give a little speech which always says, you know, we want your voices in here. The leadership groups give them a way in to have a sort of a role in the community, and they assign them a buddy. Okay? But also in this community, in order to come to the community, because one of the problems with a lot of these international communities is, like the Ministry of Finance will send, because it's international travel, send somebody as a favor to come to the meeting, right, rather than somebody who's actually active. So that was a bit of a problem that they used to have in the early days, but what they started to say is, we must always have somebody who's been to at least, from your country, from each country, who's been at least 2 times before, plus you can send somebody else who hasn't been before, but there must always be somebody who's been twice before. So from the same country will come somebody who's been at least twice, and the newcomer will come with that person. And then they'll get assigned a buddy from another country.
I'm having fun trying to think what hazing for the internal auditor group looks like. There is.
And actually, in a virtual community, we had what you call the welcome wagon, and that was a little subgroup of the community that was in charge of inducing newcomers, giving them a sense of what has happened so far, and so on and so forth.
And in those, it's an interesting question in terms of the public accounts committees that I was working with in Southern and Eastern Africa. I mean, one of the reasons why the World Bank wanted a community of practice for them was because MPs have a very high turnover. And so you might train new MPs in public oversight. MPs, that's not an American word, is it?
And we're just talking about you train principals over and over and over.
So right. Right, but MPs are members of parliament. So they wanted a community of practice because they didn't have the funding to keep training new principals. And so if you have a community of practice, which is a sort of social space in which the knowledge exists outside the particular individuals. So, I mean, as long as you've got a certain core group, when you've got new people coming in, the knowledge stays in the group. So you have your way of creating a shared memory, you have your relationships, you have your practices, and so the learning continues through practices, it continues through the ways in which you have captured the knowledge in the group, which is not just capturing them in the form of books, but is capturing it in the form of practices and stories that people tell to each other. And when you get a new person coming in, when you do a case clinic, somebody comes in as a new person, there's enough knowledge that has been there for a while in the few people who are there. So it sort of acts as a social space, a container for the knowledge, and then new people come in and out. It doesn't work if it's always new people. So you've got to have a certain amount of continuity, but not full. You don't actually need full continuity.
And in a relationship between a community of practice and training, so what I've seen, for instance, there was a community in a technology company on mass storage, and that community said you cannot be a member of our community unless you've taken the training, Mass Storage 101, in the training department. So for them, they didn't want to waste their time with someone who didn't know the basics. So they demanded that you at least go through the training so that you can engage meaningfully with others. They wanted to keep the community because they wanted to keep the community for difficult issues. They didn't want to re-explain the basics to newcomers. So that was one of the.
Has anybody ever experienced that, like at a district? Like I'm trying to think what the unit of the community of practice could be. Like state feels really large, but have you ever experienced it like at the district level? That type of kind of sense about the knowledge is not so much in the individuals, but in the group and the turnover people assimilate and that. You have? You feel like that was at DCPS, DC Public Schools?
The only positive experience I've had with this was there, where we have communities of practice going all the time.
Okay. And was it?
As district staff.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because in what it kind of looks like in practice is often like, say you see somebody with a problem, then you're able to say, oh, have you spoken to so-and-so? They've experienced the same thing. So you go off and talk to so-and-so. Right? So, you know, the knowledge stays in the community in the form of stories and connections between people. Yeah.
It seems like it could work really well for sort of role-alike people. So, but
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you've had success where it's people. I mean, I can imagine how it could work if there's a particular issue that you're trying to solve and involves lots of different kinds of people. But it seems like it's most suited to people who really are doing the same thing.
Yeah, really, really good question. Yeah.
So traditionally, it has been that way, I would say, and more recently, we've had more communities that were cross roles, in order to reimagine a boundary practice between them. So we could imagine, and actually, an important role of the community of surgeons that I was talking about in Canada, the oncological surgeons. Is that they have regular participation from hospital administrators. So these people do a lot of data analysis, comparing hospitals on mortality rates on different kind of operations, and they involve the administrators. So the community also is a place where surgeons and administrators can talk in a different relationship. So the relationship is learning. Of course, administrators tend to view data as judgment of the hospital, as opposed to how can we learn from that. And so what they're trying to create is a space where administrators and surgeons can have a different kind of conversations about data analysis and results. And I don't know if that's how that would translate into a district, but I can imagine that a principal or a superintendent really views data as like my measure of success, as opposed to what can we learn from that data in a kind of different kind of conversation. So in a way, what we're trying to say is that there are different kind of conversation when the reflection is about learning than when it is about sort of like how do we look good. Okay, I just wanted to quickly give you another story of another activity that we did. This is in Nigeria with a group of local government officials. And what they did, it was a useful exercise, that they looked at their practice and they look at different dimensions of their practice. These are people who do budgets for governments. And they look at different aspects of their practice. So you could imagine that first you create ceilings for different ministries, then you negotiate with the ministries, you create a letter to invite. So there are different dimensions of their practice. And so what they did as a community was to describe these different dimensions of their practice from a 0 to 4 in terms of advancement, from really beginners, we don't really do a budget or something like this, to world class. And they described their own practice. It was a collective exercise. We formed subgroups around those different practices. They described them. And then they created a kind of model of their practice. Here they are not debating it, but on the wall, what you can't quite see here is that these sheets of paper, these big sheets of paper, have become kind of like, almost like a self-ranking model for different dimensions of the practice. And I don't know that if you did it for principals, there could be kind of like one of the practices, who do you decide to evaluate when? Another practice is how do you enter the classroom? Another one is how do you take notes? I'm inventing, but you could see that a practice like evaluating could be divided into different aspects of it, And you could say, if you are very good, what does it look like? If you're not very good, what does it look like? And so on and so forth. And here, the countries have self-evaluated on that, on those scales. And now, the truth is, I don't know if this committee is going to survive because the funding, but the idea was, if you are good at a certain practice, then you have an accountability to the community to bring others to your level. So the idea here is, and this is where evaluation is tricky, when evaluation is a ranking and when evaluation is a who could help who. And in a sense, a community that functions well, if you are good at something and the community isn't, there's something wrong with you. You see what I mean? So the purpose of a community is not just to be good, but it is to have a collective commitment to excellence. Because I heard someone say, no, people always rank themselves as excellent because if you rank yourself as excellent, you don't have to do anything. In a community, if you are excellent, that's when you have to do something, which is to make sure that the rest of the community also becomes excellent. So in good communities, there is a sense of collective need to be excellent. And it works a bit easier in business, because in business, you need to be successful for you to keep your job. The company has to be successful. So sometimes it's a bit easier to say, okay, no, the business unit in Libya needs to be as good as the business unit in Hong Kong. So there is a sense of it's maybe a bit easier than in a system where results are not so obvious. So I think one of the difficulty in education is that it's contentious what success means, right? And so I understand that for you it is a complicated system, except that you have the advantage that people care. Okay, so for you, that's where I think we have to be so careful not to kill the caring. And to me, one of the important things that evaluation and what you're trying to do has to ensure is that it's a way to allow people to care, rather than squeeze people into administrative systems. And I don't know how to do that, but it seems to me that what you have in education, often in healthcare also, is people who go into these jobs because they really care, And it seems to me that a community approach could be a way to invite that caring into some kind of collective commitment to excellence. So we didn't want to spend too much time here because we can go into that further if you're interested. But we thought we would show you the model that we use. It's almost like a kind of theory of change for social learning. And we actually use this model both for planning a community and for running a community and also for evaluating a community. So
basically, if we look at the theory of change aspect of it, the idea is that you start with some activity, right, which generates some kind of immediate value. In other words, people are excited and engaged, and that gives them insights, ideas. They might produce documents. It produces relationships, and then they go away and they put them into practice. Now, this is, right, often traditional learning stops here, right? But we're saying that part of the learning process is putting them into practice, because putting them into practice isn't just applying something, it's using your imagination to be able to adapt it, to adopt it, and often it doesn't even look like what it looked like here. So there's a lot of creativity that goes into actually putting it into practice, and then you see the results. And sometimes it's transformative.
And what's important in a community which is different from just a course or a conference is that because the community has continuity, the loop doesn't stop here. the loop has to go back. So if by applying an idea of the community, you have a success or a failure, it's really incumbent upon you to feed that back into the community. So imagine, for instance, that out of this meeting, somebody has a great idea. There's a commitment to go. Okay, I'm going to go try that. But there's also a commitment, next meeting in 6 months or whatever, to say, okay, who has done something with what we discussed, and what have you learned? Did it work? Did it not work? So it's really, in some sense, you could think of learning as a flow between these different forms of value. Yeah.
So then what that, the implication of that to me says that you definitely have to be thoughtful of who is participating or observing
Mhm.
or engaging in the
Mhm.
community of practice, because then the participants might not be as open to share their failures if, for example, someone who's providing oversight over what they're supposed to be doing is also kind of listening in to the community of practice. Would you, I see you nodding your head.
Yeah, you have to be careful of who's there, because if you've got people in the room who are taking notes and saying, I see, then that's not going to work. So they've either got to be people who can put that aside, and some people have. Etienne talked yesterday about one community we worked with who were funding organizations and NGOs, non-governmental organizations. And it was like, hang on a sec, how could we be in the same community? Are we going to talk about our failures in front of our funders? Excuse me. And so there was that, I mean, that was a community where we tried to take that by the horns and say, well, what we do have is a shared commitment to learning. Now that's going to mean something for the funders, and it's going to mean something for the NGOs. And it was something that did need working on. So that was an instance where we did actually bring sort of incompatible people talking about failure together and tried to deal with it. But in a lot of communities, they just say, no, we don't want those people in the room. There must be spaces where we can just talk about this together.
Yeah, actually, we worked with an engineering company, actually an automotive company, and there the engineers said, we don't want our managers in our community. We want this community to be an engineering community where we can talk candidly about what we face. So what they did is that the managers became their own communities. So they had what they call tech clubs. They were not called communities, they were called tech clubs. But it doesn't matter, they were still communities of practice. And then they have executive tech clubs. And so there was an interesting relationship between those two communities. For instance, if the community of engineers had an idea that required some funding, then they would go to the executive community and tell their story and ask for funding. So there was an interesting relationship between the two communities, but they were two different communities.
But once you've got all of those things which are all part of the learning, it's not like these are sort of like not the learning. This is the learning and this is the application of it. This is all the learning. All of that and the loops are part of the learning. But how we use it with communities to plan and vision is to say, okay, so for example, if this is what we want to create here, what are our aspirations for immediate value? And so you can get a community to say, all right, so what we want to do, all right, we want to have like really great meetings. We don't want boring meetings. You know, we don't want this, we don't want that. So you can actually set up your aspirations and have some indicators for it. You know, okay, so we've got people coming back over and over again. Okay, so those are some indicators here. Potential value, okay, good. So we want to generate potential value. What are our aspirations? Well, let's be concrete about this. What do we aspire to in terms of potential value?
And potential value would be the kind of documents, for instance, that the IACOP, the Internal Auditors Community produced. This, we call this potential value because it's a tool, but it only creates actual value when it's put into practice. Yeah.
But also applied value, because actually, in our experience, a lot of communities actually also finish here. They say, oh yeah, no, we want our great communities and we want to be doing all these things, right? But they don't necessarily think of applied value, but saying, okay, so what are the practices when you get back into your country, your state, your school, right? what are the things, what are the practices that you want to change, right? What are going to change? And so you come to some kind of negotiation among the community about the kind of practices that are going to change when you get back home, and what are going to be the results.
So you can see that we have additional types of value that we have now put into the model. And the reason why we put strategic value in the model of learning itself is that we've found that good communities maintain good relationship with their stakeholders. So I don't know, if in a district you had a community of practice of principles, then an important part of that community is how do you maintain good relationship with district superintendents or with the state. So part of the learning of a community is also to have strategic discussion with their stakeholders. And that's very much what happened in this automotive company, where the engineering community really maintained an ongoing relationship with the executive tech club as part of viewing their learning within the strategic context of the rest of the organization.
And once you've set your aspirations, actually then you can say, well, if those are our aspirations, what are the conditions that need to be in place in order to achieve that? So you can actually then start putting in some conditions. And if you have conditions, then you also often need, we can include in here, the enabling factors that enable those conditions to be met, which is often a support team or a secretariat sometimes, yeah.
And we would put the leadership groups as an enabling value. When a community, if leadership groups become a natural part of the life of a community, this is really an enabling value that the community has learned to create for itself.
And we've been doing it in a sort of linear way like this, but actually often communities sometimes start off because there's a practice, for example, that needs to be changed, or a practice needs changing, or practices need changing, right? And so then you work backwards. So if that practice needs changing, what are the kind of connections we need, the documents we need to produce in order to make that happen? Okay, so if we're going to be producing that, then how are we going to generate immediate value in the production of that? So you can work both ways through this.
And an important vehicle for learning in a community is what we call learning stories. So a learning story is simply, hey, I participated in this great SREB meeting, we had great food, great conversations. I got this idea, I tried it, this is what happened, and this is the effect it had on my district. So these are what we would call learning stories that some communities have learned to tell as a genre of stories, like, I don't know, a novel, a romantic novel. You have to have the couple, they have to have trouble, the parents don't agree, and so on. So we know that there are different genres of story. This is a genre of story. And actually there's a community of practice of principles in Hong Kong, in Singapore, where they have a check-in, check-out. Whenever they have a meeting, they have 4 meetings a year, quarterly meetings. And so when they get together, they say, anybody has a learning story? They call them value creation stories. Everybody has a value creation story to share about what they've done with what we've produced. So that's the check-in. And then the check-out is, can you project a learning stories into your practice? Can you imagine what you were going to do? And so they end the meeting by using stories like this to project their learning into the future. So for them, it's become, again, an enabling value. Learning how to tell those stories has become a learning vehicle, because if somebody reports that they've done something interesting with an idea that came out during the meeting, that is also learning. To learn what somebody else has done with what you discussed is maximizing the learning of the whole if this is fed back into the group. So you can see that this is kind of formalizing a little bit this practice-based learning by talking about those loops, and we find it really useful for communities to have a more formal definition of different dimensions of learning that allows them to manage themselves as a community.
And it's used, we shouldn't, I mean, the biggest way this is actually used is evaluation. Evaluation of the activities of a community or a network, yeah, is to collect indicators along that way and to collect stories.